Estimating the amount of time it will take to implement your ERP or HCM or digital transformation solution is one of the biggest challenges that organizations have. In fact, we found that most organizations take materially longer to implement their solution than they expect. So what's the key? How do we figure out the right implementation duration for our organization? I'm going to talk about that here in today's video. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformations. And as I mentioned in the intro, implementation durations are hard to predict. A lot of organizations will find that they spend a lot more time than they expected. They have trouble estimating the amount of time, and there's a lot of disappointment that comes along with running over the estimated time frame. You run into issues with change fatigue and people getting burned out on the project. So there's a lot of problems that come along with not having a realistic implementation duration to begin with. So what I want to talk about today is how to define the implementation duration that makes the most sense for your organization and to tailor that estimated duration based on who you are as an organization. So to start, the first input into estimating your implementation duration is to get the proposals and the estimated plans from your software vendor, your system integrators, whoever it is you might be interacting with on your project. So to start, we'll take that as an input. We'll just call this the proposed plan. And the problem is a lot of companies take this at face value. They get whatever boilerplate, generic template they get from their vendor and system integrators. They'll assume that that's the duration it's going to take. Even if they add a little bit of contingency to that, it's typically still not enough for organizations. And typically these numbers, the durations that you get in a proposed plan, are typically a lot lower than reality. And so let's unpack that and understand why that is, first of all, and then we'll talk about how to translate this into something that's more meaningful for you as an organization. The first issue that we have with these types of plans is that there are assumptions that are flawed. So in other words, the assumptions aren't necessarily something that matches your needs as an organization. For example, it may assume that you are going to make decisions very quickly, or that your business processes aren't going to change that much, or that you're going to have a big bang approach when maybe a phased approach is more suitable for you as an organization. So there's a lot of assumptions here that no matter what kind of due diligence and discovery a software vendor does, part of the challenge is that the assumptions still aren't going to be aligned with what your needs are. So that's one challenge that we have with these project plans. The second challenge that we have with these types of proposed plans is that they are not all-inclusive. What I mean by that is your software vendor, your system integrator typically is not going to provide, either because they can't, don't want to, don't have the right competency, whatever the case may be. They typically don't provide all of the things you need to make your transformation successful. So not including all the things that are required for a successful transformation is another problem. So let's just say, for example, the vendor proposes to you that they can get this done in 12 months. Well, they may not have considered the fact that there's data migration, there's change management, and a number of other things that they may not do that needs to be factored into your plan. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, so we'll come back to that point here in just a second. So that's a second challenge that we find that will misalign your proposed plan with the actual reality that we'll talk about here in a moment. And then the next challenge we have is that organizations, system integrators, vendors that are providing these proposed plans, we just have to recognize the realities. This isn't meant to be malicious. I don't think software vendors are trying to lie or deceive, but they're salespeople and they are in sales mode. So what I mean by that is they're not necessarily incented or incentivized to be overly conservative and assume the worst, assume it's going to take you a lot longer than maybe you could implement if things were perfect. So being that they're in sales mode, they're probably in a competitive situation. They probably know they're in a competitive situation. They've got commissions they need to meet. They've got to make a certain number of sales to save their jobs, protect their jobs, and to make money. So all the incentives for them are to downplay and to maybe suggest that in a perfect world, you could implement their solution in X amount of time. So we have to recognize that that's another challenge or another strike here with this proposed plan, is that it's not aligned necessarily with reality, it's aligned with what they think they can sell. Now, just to back up for a second, I'm going to talk about what to do to translate this into a more realistic plan. But before we do that, the first thing to recognize is that when we look at an actual project plan for any implementation that's been completed, we've done research over the years and found that the average implementation in reality, not in a proposed plan, but in reality, takes about 18 months. So I'm just going to mark that here so you can just have that in the back of your mind, that most implementations take around 18 months. Now, this is an average. If you're a big multinational company, it's going to take you longer. If you're a smaller organization with not a very complex set of needs, you could possibly do this in less time. But let's just use that as an average, as 18 months. And by the way, this is data that we published in our 2020 ERP report. You can find that and download that report along with other benchmarks and data points, best practices in the links below. So we'll hold on to that 18 months. We'll come back to that here in a second. Now, to translate this into a plan that makes the most sense for you, the first step we have to do is to add the variables that are unique to us. So we're just going to call these unique variables. These are the things that drive implementation durations up or down. And by the way, these same variables also apply to cost, which is a topic for another time. But these unique variables are things that we need to think of it as kind of a visual here. We're gonna run these through the machine of adding reality, adding our unique factors to translate this into something that comes out the other side as something more realistic for us. Now, the first thing we need to look at is the complexity of your business. So companies that are more complex, they just inherently are going to take longer. They might be longer than 18 months. If you're a simple business that's a pure distribution company, you're focused on volume, you're not selling a very complex product, you already have e-commerce and other capabilities built to support the business, you might get this done sooner. And you certainly will get this done sooner, most likely, than a complex aerospace and defense manufacturer or a custom manufacturer of building supplies or whatever the case may be. So the complexity of your business is the first step. The next thing we look at is number of locations. So how many locations are you operating out of? Are you a single location? Are you multiple locations? Are you 10, 20, 30? And not just number of locations, but number of countries you operate in. So a company that's based in, let's just say in the UK, and they have 10 locations in the UK, is going to have a very different implementation time frame than another company, same industry, that has 10 locations, but those 10 locations are spread across Europe or across multiple continents. Those are going to be very different implementations. And certainly a single location client is typically going to take less time than one that perhaps has dozens or in some cases hundreds of locations. The next thing we have to think about is magnitude of change. This is one that's underrated, one that not enough companies think about. So the magnitude of change is something we need to think about, and think of this as a spectrum. I'm just going to whiteboard just some rough notes down here. Let's just consider this no change at all. This is massive change. Depending on where you are on the spectrum, that's going to drive how much time you take. So companies that are focused over here on big change, they're going to take longer than the companies that are more over here, closer to incremental change, or in some extreme cases, there's companies that are just simply automating what they're already doing, and they have no aspirations to go through a major transformation, and that's okay, as long as they're deliberate about what they're doing there. So the magnitude of change we're going through is another big driver of our overall implementation duration. The next thing we need to think about is how well defined are our business processes. And I'm not saying how well are they, how effective are they, I'm saying how well are they defined? How well do we understand them? Are they documented? Is there a lot of work we have to do to define those processes? So process definition is very important. It's companies that already have a pretty good handle on their current state, even though that current state's going to change, they tend to go a little faster through the implementation because they have a good starting point to launch from. Whereas companies that don't have that handle end up spending more time on defining that current state so they can get to that future state. And we actually have a whole video focused on how to handle business process mapping, when we do it, how much do we focus on as is versus to be. I've included a link to that video as well below. Along these same lines, a process definition is level of standardization. So if we are moving from a decentralized model to a highly centralized, standardized model, that's going to take longer. That's going to drive this plan to higher implementation duration simply because it's a bigger change. So it ties back to this magnitude of change component here. So that's something to watch for, because a lot of companies are trying to get standardization, but they base their plan on getting there based on the initial plan that they get from their vendors and system integrators. The other driver of your implementation duration is going to be the level of alignment. What I mean by that is internal alignment. So how well aligned is the executive team on what they want this project to be, what they want to be when they grow up? How well aligned is the project team on how they can best support that vision for the company? And how well aligned is the overall internal team? Now, this is a hard one for people in organizations to assess. And actually, a lot of these things are difficult for people to assess unless you've done a lot of ERP implementations in the past. But this one in particular is difficult because it may be all you know. You may just be used to the political environment, the internal dynamics you have, and most of your people may be used to it. But what we do as outside consultants is assess and benchmark you to other organizations based on what we see and what we gather through organizational assessments and other inputs that we gather through the process to figure out how well aligned are you now. And the less aligned you are right now, the more time it's going to take, just because it's going to take some time to get people aligned and get them on the same page before we start building and deploying new processes and new technologies. And then finally, there's a lot more than just the ones we're covering here today, but I'm covering the major components of what drives implementation duration. Another one is the level of technical change. So this is a little bit different. I do think it's worth calling out, even though it's similar to magnitude of change. Here we're talking about the level of technical change and technology change. So in particular, if we're moving from let's say we're moving from a legacy AS400 based system, fairly immature product, maybe it's been heavily customized. Now we're going to roll out a heavily standardized system like SAP or Oracle or one of these modern, robust, complex, sophisticated systems. That's a big technical change for people, and it drives this magnitude of change. But we call it out here because it's also important to look at how does that affect your IT department, because your IT department supporting the project in some way is also going to be impacted, and that often requires a redesign of the organization within IT, which will take longer to deploy for the overall transformation. Now, the next thing we need to do to get to our idealistic or our tailored implementation plan is going to be to add to our scope. And that may sound counterintuitive, like how can we add to our scope? Why would we want to add to our scope before we've ever started? Let me tell you what I mean by that. Now, I mentioned before that the proposed plan that you typically get from your software vendors, your system integrators, are not all-inclusive. They're almost always, in most cases that I can recall, missing some major components that are going to be critical to your success. Either they're things that you need to hire outside help for, or it might be things you have internal resources that can help with, but either way, it's going to take time and resources, which is going to affect your overall implementation duration. So we need to add to our scope. We need to add these things back to our scope so that we are basing our estimated time based on the actual scope of the project. Now, some of the things that come to mind and some of the high priority things, the most common things that are missing from scope are going to be things like change management. So organizational change management, or OCM. Those are things that's something that's almost always missing from these system integrator plans. They'll typically have training, communications, some basic downstream change management activities, but they're more often than not missing some of the critical strategic change management things that need to happen early in the project, things that will help you drive alignment, things that will help you drive the magnitude of change, the organizational readiness, the organizational design as we define how our processes are going to be defined, or how our processes in our organization is going to be standardized. All those things require organizational change support. Otherwise, we risk all of this stuff happening in a vacuum on a piece of paper, a conceptual model that we haven't actually rolled out. So we need to have an organizational change support team that can support these activities to help drive that, and that does take time, and that's going to add duration to your overall project. And then, by the way, it's something I highly recommend not cutting, thinking that that's going to save you time, because if you cut this out of scope or assume that since that adds time, we're actually going to take it away, what that actually does is that increases your duration even more. So keep in mind, this was never reality. If we add OCM, yes, it is going to stretch it out, but if we don't add OCM, it's going to stretch it out even more. So adding OCM is actually your best bet to actually realize a faster implementation. Now, another common component we see missing is the whole data migration bucket. And a lot of times this task or activity is relegated to a bulleted footnote or assumption in the statement of work from the system integrator or vendor that says that customer shall be responsible for data migration. Now, the software vendor and the system integrator might provide you some tools to help with data migration. They might actually help you migrate the data over to the new system, but they typically are going to leave it on you to clean up your data, to map the data to the new system, to figure out how you're going to bring it over, that sort of thing. And even if they do help you with that, typically this activity takes a lot longer than is assumed over here. Keep in mind, this is an ideal state utopia that rarely ever materializes, this proposed plan. So back to the assumptions here, we often assume in these proposed plans that data migration is going to be simple, your data is clean, and it's going to map very neatly over to the new system, which is rarely true. So this activity, whether it's included in your system integrator's plan or not, or whether you need to do it yourself, typically adds to the duration of the project. Now, just a couple other things, and this is a very long list, so I'll only cover the high points or the high priority points here. But some of the other ones include program management. Just the overall governance, the decision-making that goes into this, pulling together resources outside of what the system integrator and vendor are providing, managing all those resources, that takes time, and that typically extends your duration. There's also the process mapping, the process definition. So keep in mind, if I'm a software vendor, I don't necessarily care what your business processes are going to look like as long as I can build the software, design it, and configure it and customize it in a way that I think meets those needs. And that may or may not entail business process mapping. But if I don't do the business process mapping, I don't take the time to do that, it's going to be very difficult to train people. It's going to be very difficult to go through user acceptance testing in a comprehensive way. So we really need to make sure that's done. And ideally, we've done this process mapping before we've actually started deploying the technology. Companies that spend more time up front before bringing on all the consultants to start building stuff, companies that have done more of this work up front are going to implement faster than ones that haven't. So the degree to which you've done business process mapping prior to the implementation definitely affects your overall plan and scope. And then finally, a bucket that I'll cover here today is, we'll call it the system architecture. And I don't want to get too technical here, partly because I'm not a super technical person to begin with, but partly because it's not the technical nature of this that matters. What matters is when we talk about system architecture, we're assuming there's going to need to be third-party integration to other systems. Oftentimes up here, we're assuming that we're not going to integrate or that the ERP system we've selected is going to cover all the needs of the organization. But inevitably, as the project continues in its duration, we find that there's a need to integrate to other third-party systems, and this can hold up a project and delay it. So we need to make sure we've got eyes wide open into what are these potential third-party systems. And just as a word of warning, if you've bought an ERP system and assume that's going to do everything that you need it to be, I would take a long, hard look at that and make sure that that's true, because we find more often than not that that's not true. Even if a system integrator or VAR or vendor tells you that the ERP system can do everything that you think you need it to do, we find that if you really dig into it during your evaluation process, you'll find otherwise. So make sure you've accounted for that activity in your implementation planning. So I've given you some high-level conceptual things to think about here. Now, what I haven't done is told you exactly how do I get from this 18-month average to a number that makes sense for us. I've told you generally what's going to drive those numbers up or down, some of the things we need to make sure we have included in our scope, which will drive your project duration most likely up. And there is a combination of science and art that goes into this. That's the scope for another project, another discussion. But I would encourage you, if you do want to talk more about this and how we actually apply specific numbers to get to that conceptual number that we think it's going to take, I encourage you to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below, as well as a number of links to other resources that might help you in your digital transformation. So I encourage you to check those out in the links below. And I'd love to hear what comments you have. What has your experience been with implementation durations? What's your expectation for your implementation duration? What are just general comments or questions you have? Please include that in the comment field below. Finally, if you could, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope you found this information useful. Look forward to speaking with you soon.